Sarah, go ahead,
Okay,
please.
thank you. Morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here this morning to talk about my work looking at key performance indicators for beef herds. I think having listened to the other presentations this morning, I think it will fit in quite nicely and reiterate some other points that have already been made. So we'll start off just by thinking a little bit about what key performance indicators are, or KPIs. So they're used widely across many industries to monitor the efficiency of production and to inform management decision making. They tend to be fairly widely used in the dairy, pork and poultry sectors, less so in the beef sector traditionally. Several reasons for this. So beef enterprises tend to be more extensive than dairy, pork and poultry. So cattle are handled less frequently, data is just more difficult to collect. They also tend to be smaller enterprises, so there's just less data available, smaller number of animals. And they also tend to be part of a multi-enterprise farm, so often the farmer's sole focus isn't just on the beef enterprise, he's often got his attention diverted elsewhere, which again can make data more challenging to collect. So in England, the beef sector is really diverse. There's lots of different system types, from sucklers to calf rearers, finishers, grower finishers, and all sorts of combinations thereof. Lots of different types of land, so upland systems, lowland systems, different breeds suiting these different systems. And this diversity makes it really hard to define a set of performance indicators that are going to be applicable sector-wide. So the aim of this project was to evaluate performance indicators used in beef herds in England, so what farmers can realistically and reliably record, how we can use that, and how we can predict farm success from that data. So to do this, I followed the following three objectives. So I wanted to appraise farm attitudes towards data use, and we did this through focus group discussion and through distribution of a questionnaire. I wanted to make the outcomes sort of relevant to the industry, so to provide guidance for farmers and vets and advisors on how data can be used on farm, and this was done through generation of knowledge exchange material. I also wanted to look at evidence on how these performance indicators can affect overall success, so what the relationships are between them and a definition of farm success. So this is an overview of the project. So the project was guided by a technical advisory group, or TAG, which is essentially a focus group that met quarterly to discuss performance indicators for the beef sector. It consisted of beef farmers, so we had 4 farmers. They included sucklers and grower finishers from upland and lowland systems to try and incorporate as much of the sector as possible. 4 beef advisors, so they were consultants and vets. AHDB beef and lamb scientists, so that's the Farmer Levy Board in England, scientists from there, and then University of Nottingham academics. And through this discussion, we generated a list of performance indicators, so from what people were currently using, and we scored those against characteristics of an optimal performance indicator, so what we felt performance indicators should be doing. That allowed us to rank them, and we found that the ones that ranked the highest tended to be the more comprehensive ones, so the ones that measured multiple aspects of performance, with the more specific ones sort of falling underneath. And this allowed us to structure them into a sort of hierarchy, which we then termed a toolkit to reflect the diversity of the industry and the fact that it allowed farmers and advisors to select appropriate performance indicators depending on the specific circumstances of the farm at that time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The farmers in the group also gave us some data, which we analysed to generate some case study material for knowledge exchange events, and these were designed to sort of engage with farmers around data capture and use, and to motivate farmers around that area. I wanted to gain a wider sort of spectrum of opinion as well. Obviously, it was great that we had these 4 really proactive farmers as part of the group, but I wanted to get a wider variety of opinion around data capture and data use. So that was done through a questionnaire. And then to further look at these relationships between performance indicators and overall farm success, a slightly larger data set was used initially, and then this was further developed into a simulation model. So the results from the first objective, so looking at appraising farm attitudes towards data use, of the questionnaire that we distributed, 48% of respondents used some form of herd management software to collect their data, and some of these will also have been calculating performance indicators as well. Of these, 14% used their own bespoke programs, so these were mainly in programs like Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Access. And I think this sort of highlights the fact that there's some of the commercial programs out there perhaps don't always do what the farmers need it to. 16% of the respondents used electronic ID tags, and the most popular reason for this was that it enabled quick and easy recording of data. 50% would like to record more data, and the most popular reason for not doing that quoted was time. And I think those last 2 points sort of highlight that automated data collection systems might be the way forward with helping some of these farmers collect more data. Weight data was the most common thing that farmers didn't record but would like to. And farmers tended to find data analysis harder than collection, which is encouraging, because that's something that vets and advisors can certainly help with, and there seemed to be an appetite among farmers for that. So the results of Objective 2, so this was providing guidance for farmers and advisors. This was largely done through generation of the KPI Toolkit, which I mentioned at the beginning. So this is a section of it up here, and the full version can be found at the reference at the bottom. So as I said before, it's structured in a hierarchical fashion with these more comprehensive performance indicators at the top and then more specific ones underneath, which can then be broken down further into even more specific indicators or looking at things like data distribution. And the idea of this is that it can be used as a sort of structure for having these conversations on farm and sort of a decision-making pathway whereby overall farm performance can be monitored by these comprehensive indicators, and then more specific problems can be investigated using the more specific ones. So Objective 3 was to look at the relationships between these performance indicators and overall enterprise success. This was done initially through analysis of a slightly larger data set, and then that was further developed into a simulation model. So we defined overall enterprise success as net margin per cow bred, and that was defined through discussion with the focus group. And as I said, initially I used a data set containing about 56 suckler farms over 3 years, and multiple regression to look at the associations between the performance indicators and net margin per cow bred. But limitations on the size and the content of the data set just meant that this needed to be further developed, and so simulation modelling was used to do that. So this is a stochastic model, so that deals with uncertainty in the system, and they lend themselves really well to systems where there's inherent uncertainty. So values for the model were drawn randomly from input distributions in the 5 areas, so the cow inputs, reproduction inputs, growth, health and financial. And these randomly drawn values were then incorporated into the model, and a net margin per cow bred was produced. I've included 2 calving seasons so that events in calving season 1 can influence production in calving season 2, so things like dystocia and when in the calving period the cow calved can then influence their performance in the second season. So again, outputs from this model were analysed by multiple regression so that we got an independent and individual effect for each performance indicator on net margin per cow bred. So the coefficients here just indicate the change in net margin per cow bred for a unit change in the performance indicator. So for a % increase in weaning weight, there was an associated £2.92 increase in net margin per cow bred. There was also an associated increase in net margin per cow bred for an increase in weaning weight, and for an increase in replacement rate, there was a decrease in net margin per cow bred. These are then scaled up to sort of illustrate the differences between the best and the worst performing herds in the data set or in the simulated data, just to highlight how much of a difference it can make. Admittedly, they're not massive figures, but to put it into context, I put at the bottom that the average net margin per cow bred for a spring calving suckler herd in England in 2016 was minus £114.76. So these tend to be fairly marginal enterprises, and it's these marginal gains that I think can make them more economically viable. So model 2 is looking at some of the more specific performance indicators. So the first model concentrated on these more comprehensive, overarching ones. And again, there were associations there, significant associations between these indicators and net margin per cow bred. So daily live weight gain to weaning, an increase of 0.1 kilo per day was associated with a £20.40 increase in net margin per cow bred. Percent born alive, again, was associated with an increase, and that's a percent of calves born alive from all the cows that were bred. So that's incorporating sort of fertility and stillbirths and abortions and things like that. Cull rate, mortality rate and pre-weaning mortality rate were all associated with decreases in net margin per cow bred. And again, that's been scaled up to highlight the differences between the best and the worst performers of the simulated herds. So this data can now go forward to be used to sort of further modify and validate the KPI toolkit so that it can be further enhanced through data analysis. So in summary, focus group discussion allowed the development of this KPI toolkit and ensured that the outputs remained relevant to the beef industry. Distribution of a questionnaire allowed collection of a wider variety of farmer opinion, again to make sure that it was applicable to as much of the sector as possible. An analysis of data collected on real farms and developed through a simulation model allowed further evaluation of the relationships between these performance indicators and overall enterprise success. I'd like to thank my funders, so the University of Nottingham and AHDB Beef and Lamb, supervisors, Dr. Chris Hudson and Professor Martin Green, and the tag farmers and advisors and all the input into the project that they provided. Just before any questions, there's a couple of opportunities at Nottingham to come and join the team if anybody's interested. Have a chat to one of us or drop Chris Hudson an email and we can give you some more information. Thank you.